stretch. Sometimes staying focused, it takes a second. I know it does for me on a morning like this where it is a little bit gloomier. But as we prepare for today's message, let's think of some of the things that we talked about last week. When someone is born, the marathon metaphor from last week is the same. Some families, systems, and lifestyles are more prepared than others. Many times, it has nothing to do with the person being born, but just the hand that is dealt in that very moment that determines how difficult the marathon of life is going to be for that person. Now, there are things that we can all do to make our lives better. And more importantly, as Christians, there are things we can do to make others' lives better. And yet we must also admit there are many things, as we know, that are out of our control, both in our lives and in the lives of others. Control. The ability to feel control makes us feel safe. As I mentioned in a sermon a few months ago, our brains are actually wired to be able to feel safe, to stay in a healthy, proactive environment. But when we do not feel safe, when we realize that something in our life isn't safe, when we feel like we have lost control, the state of grief becomes heightened. We begin to ask really big faith questions. And if they're not answered fast enough, we attempt to take back from whatever control we have let go. We find ourselves denying our pain, denying our struggles, and that often leads to denying God. And yet when this denial doesn't work, it turns to that feeling of anger, that ever-changing pattern of grief without an outlet that begins to simmer at this negative place. It feels like the loneliest feeling in this world, the feelings of grief that have been experienced by humans since we were able to feel love and loss. So besides Aaron, does anyone else know where the title for this Easter sermon series comes from? A reminder, if you don't know, it is what is grief, if not love persevering? I know Aaron knows. I know my husband knows. So it is strange that is the third week in this series, and I have not actually mentioned this theme's reference once. Kind of wondered why? Well, in this post-resurrection Easter season, as we figure out what to do with this newfound reality of a risen Christ, and what that really means if we're going to move forward in a healthy way, the first week we needed to name our struggles and griefs as a community. And we continue to need to always name those. And then last week we kind of named our struggles within our community and the realities of the larger world. And now that those have been named or at least set before us, we can begin to dig a little deeper into the complexities of such a large question. What is grief, if not love persevering? So this question actually comes from a recent television show that, in my totally not humble opinion, let me repeat that. This is not a humble opinion. This show, to me, is completely about grief. The main character in this show had lost her parents, her only brother, her home, and the love of her life. And as she watched the love of her life die at the hands of another, She screams at that person, "You took everything from me." For this characters, it's important to know that all of these losses came in her childhood, in her early adulthood, and then even later. And thus, even before this television show began, she had been a character in movies, and that's where she lost everything. So the television show is about what happens next. What happens when you feel you've lost everything? How do you continue? This is a universal question, and there are many nuances and stories that focus on this suffering at its most terrible. And many years ago, there were also people who wrote a story that dealt with this exact same question. The writer or writers needed insights and wisdom when trying to understand the deepest heartbreaks of life in relationship with God and with one another. And so they wrote a story about a time when someone lost everything. Now, I don't often engage in the book of Job when preaching. I find it to be one of the most profound books in the Bible, but it is often misused in the face of real sorrow. Job's situation is usually referred to in ways that seem to reinforce unhelpful cliches in the face of real grief. People often look to Job for answers, so they take many of its scriptures out of context or oversimplify its true, beautiful complexities. Because even though we have spent several weeks talking about and naming grief and exploring grief and embracing grief, those who know, which all of us in some ways do, real grief experiences are never able to be truly understood or explained. Everything that I say or anyone says about grief can be, should be, and will be at some point disputed. Thus, I am preaching a failed sermon series. It automatically fails. It fails because there is not really a way to completely talk about mourning in our lives in ways that truly relate to what we're feeling. Because we don't relate to things in the same way, and I'm not the same as each of you. Even if things were the same, the moments and what we need may be different. There's a simple example of these type of differences. My sister grieves on dates. Even if she doesn't remember what day it is, her body will usually clue her in to look at her calendar. Once she looks, she recognizes the date and remembers why she is feeling loss. We, as sisters, had the same mother. She died on the same day. And my sister will mourn on that day even if she doesn't remember what day it is. But of course, I will mourn at some random time that makes absolutely no sense, and on that day may be perfectly fine. The book of Job reminds us that making sense of some things in life is not possible. What our heads may know is not what our hearts and our bodies and our spirits may feel. And the book of Job does not offer us answers, but it does offer us a reflection of the struggles that come when we feel that everything is lost. It is a misery loves company book. It is a story that it has different points where everyone can relate, but we may not all relate to the same part at the same time. So as I was writing this sermon for today, I kept questioning, why am I preaching a failed sermon series at all? Why are we talking about this? I mean, I can't answer the questions in Job or in life. Even Job's friends, who provided much wisdom, still fell short of any real comfort for Job. I started thinking through maybe because misery loves company, or because even when it feels most lonely, it is important to remind ourselves we're not alone. Maybe because I, too, in this pandemic world, am imperfectly grieving in what will always be an imperfect process, seeking with you and with those who are listening ways to find love, where so often it seems there is loss and denial. I have struggled as I watched this world this last year ignore their grief. As we have said before, many don't even know how to name their grief. They're stuck in one place, and they can't move in this race of life to a new place. They're so afraid of being uncomfortable that they are stripping others' needs of comfort. There's this do nothing or stagnant response, or maybe if we just go backwards, I'm sure that will get us to where we need to go. And thus the Spirit of God has often been stilted and sometimes even weaponized. There is this fear of moving forward, and it causes so much grief. And I grieve for what is being said and not being said. I grieve for the children who are lost, the families that are broken, the friendships that are shattered. I hate, and I don't even like that word, watching all the negative and all the ignored boil in fear. And thus, as author Hannah Brencher writes, even though love covers all things, fear is what keeps us silent and keeps words unsaid. Fear keeps us standing in one place. Eventually, when it wins, it means we never got the courage to say what we needed to say. And so I fear the silence of what is unsaid, because the truth doesn't seem to want to be faced, and when it is faced, the answers forward are not easy. And even though I also know that what is said and the words and whatever is in this kind of sermon is never really going to be enough, it may not even be always the right things to say. And so we look towards the book of Job, also struggling with trying to figure out what to do when everything feels lost. And Job actually tries to balance the faithful practices of being both pastoral and prophetic in the face of grief. Because this book reminds us there are times when silence and presence are most needed. But there are also times when prophetic naming of truth is necessary to move forward. And these are the exact same skills needed by the disciples in their post-transformation of the resurrection, as they understand what it means to grieve over the changes that they have experienced with Jesus Christ. And these are the skills we need to move into a new time in this pandemic, to figure out ways to let love persevere alongside grief. We must balance back and forth between these two imperfect and yet faithful responses, even understanding their imperfect realities. The character that I talked about earlier in the television show Who Lost Everything used her superhero powers to create a false reality, a perfect sitcom. She literally created, because she's a superhero, a new reality of the way things should be. But love isn't perfect, and love cannot persevere in lies. Love, as known through a resurrected Christ, only perseveres when the tomb has been faced, when the new roads are being walked, when the new tables are being set, and the work of prophetic presence is embraced with love, as we have loved the example shown to us by a resurrected Christ. Amen.